Hello, everyone, and welcome to the fifth and final When I Dare to Be Powerful conference online talk, part of a series of podcasts and online talks where we explored voice as an act of resistance and as a tool for change and exploration. Our international conference took place last week, and it will be possible to listen to filmed recordings of the talks and of our keynote speakers soon. This week, Patricia Francis is in conversation with Irene Lusztig. Patricia is a Midlands Three Cities funded doctoral researcher at Nottingham Trent University in England. She's a filmmaker and Royal Television Society Award nominee. In 2012, Patricia set up a Syncopate Media, an independent production company. Many of her stories have been commissioned by the BBC, and she has used the platform to highlight issues ranging from the UK government's implementation of the bedroom tax through to a rise in domestic abuse cases, early onset dementia, and the plight of children carers. Patricia's independent films include Many Rivers to Cross 2013 and Making Waves 2015. Her latest film, The Art of Oppression 2021, was shortlisted in the Best Documentary category at the Midlands Movie Awards 2022 and achieved quarter-finalist position at the Sebest Film Festival in 2022 and won Best Film at the Windrush Caribbean Film Festival also in 2022. Patricia's current practice-based research explores women's activism through the medium of documentary art film. It focuses on two groups of dissenting women in Nottinghamshire, the women involved in the miners' strikes in 1984 and the women involved in the Black Lives Matter movement during the 2016 shutdown. She is exploring how to give volume and primacy to activist women's voices through artistic practice where their voices have been undermined, unheard or silenced. Welcome, Patricia, and over to you.
Alicia, hello and welcome. So this week, I'd like to introduce you to Irene Lusztig. Irene is a professor in film and digital media at the University of California, Santa Cruz. She's a filmmaker, visual artist, and archival researcher. Her film and video work mines old images and technologies for new meanings in order to reframe, recuperate, and reanimate forgotten and neglected histories. Often beginning with rigorous research in archives, her work brings historical materials into conversation with the present day, inviting viewers to explore historical spaces as a way to contemplate larger questions of politics, ideology, and the production of personal, collective, and national memories. Much of Irene's current work is centred on public feminism, language, and histories of women and women's bodies, including her debut feature, Reconstruction, a feature-length archival film essay, the Motherhood Archives, and the ongoing web-based Worry Box project. Hello, Irene, and welcome.
Hello. Thank you for having me.
It's a real pleasure to be speaking with you today. There's a lot that I'd really like to discuss with you. I'm sure we won't possibly cover everything, but we'll try. We've also got a couple of clips that we'd like to show from your films. Before we get started, can you explain what you mean by the term public feminism?
That's a good question. Let's see. I think I came into really thinking about public feminism as a kind of discourse space around the work I did for Years in Sisterhood. So that was a film based on this huge archive of letters that were sent to the editor of Ms. magazine in the 1970s. And Ms., for anyone who doesn't know, was the kind of first national circulation, kind of more mainstream feminist magazine in the US, founded in the 70s. Really, thinking about feminist conversation and thinking about what are the spaces that we have had historically and do or don't have in the present for really kind of robust public feminist conversation. I think really even before, like with Motherhood Archives, when I was thinking about histories of childbirth, the work on that film came out of this sense of a real lack or kind of something missing in the spaces we have to talk about this experience. That's like a really significant and complex and major and really big experience, and always has been for women, but really feeling this lack of complex conversation space. And I think that led me into just trying to look for histories of what have our public conversations about feminism been? How might we make new kind of conversation spaces for thinking about public feminism? So that's kind of some of the spaces where I've thought about that.
And that sort of makes sense for a lot of your films in terms of the public spaces where women talk about things that are important to them, which when I then heard and saw Richland, I actually thought, wow, this is very different to your usual work. And I thought, how is Irene how is she going to make this work? How does this still have her stamp on it? So congratulations, by the way, because you've achieved international showings, Tribeca, Sheffield Doc Fest, and DC Docs as well. So congratulations with that. I do think, though, in Richland, you give voices space in the film. So for me, there are three prevalent voices: a conservative white patriarchal voice, an Indigenous Native American voice, and the Japanese voice, embodied by Yokio, the Japanese artist, who made the Fat Man folded sculpture, which is a life-size replica of the bomb that was detonated over Nagasaki, and the image is on your cover photo. I suppose before we really get into Richland, if you could give us a brief overview of what you would say Richland is about.
Yeah, I mean, I think on the surface, kind of what it's about is it's a placemaking film kind of set in and around Richland, which is a community in South Central Washington State in the United States that has been a plutonium company town since the 1940s. It now no longer manufactures plutonium, but it's deeply involved in kind of land stewardship and nuclear cleanup, which is a kind of ongoing forever project because the half-life of plutonium is 24,000 years, so it's quite it's like into the forever future. So that's what it's about. But I think the things I was really interested coming into the project were, I think, first of all, continuing to do the kind of thinking I'm interested in around how people kind of hold and work through and look at and or don't look at histories that are difficult and violent. Certainly in the US, I think we've been in a kind of long moment of really reckoning with what it means to, be in a country built on top of genocide and slavery. And I know there's similar reckonings happening in European countries around colonialist histories. So I think, what do we do with that, and what does it mean as a community to try to look at those histories and think about them, and how and when is that in conflict with people's sense of identity or people's sense of patriotism or kind of other kinds of narratives that are really shaping community and identity. So I was interested in that. But then I think coming out of the work I did in Years in Sisterhood, I was really in just this kind of method of really expansive listening and spending time with people and listening, and even what I started calling listening across difference. So whether that's, someone spending time with a text that's different from them, which I think we'll talk about in a bit, or in the case of Richland, what it might feel like for me to make listening space with people whose politics are different from mine, or to kind of create situations where I'm bringing someone like Yuki into a space with people who are maybe not used to hearing a Japanese voice in these nuclear conversations. Yeah, and I think, in the US, and I think as also many places, we're in a moment where it's quite challenging to make really open and expansive and generous listening space with people with different politics. So I think that was kind of the core thing that I really wanted to spend time thinking about.
So that's really interesting, because you framed it around listening, I suppose, and for me, when I think about Trinity Minher, who talks about speaking nearby her subjects, and a way of filming and representing those who take part in her films as an approach to preventing their objectification, and instead as a means of enabling them to speak for themselves, I then think to myself, okay, as a feminist filmmaker, you were working with these three, what I call voices, some of which were I think it's fair to say, perhaps in conflict with your own voice. And I just wondered how you navigated that speaking nearby approach, if you did.
With people whose politics were different from mine specifically?
I just wondered. I'm thinking
Yeah.
specifically about in the film. There are two occasions in the cafe in Richland where the group of men, group of men, and one white man who so this white patriarchal dominance, and I was very mindful of, you know, the production being female, and just, you know, how you worked in that space, basically.
Yeah, I mean, those were uncomfortable spaces for me, and I think I wanted to lean into that discomfort and even just push myself to think about why is it uncomfortable and what is the address in that space. I think the second scene you're talking about in particular, that's an uncomfortable scene for a lot of viewers. I think partly because there's a you, like the speaker is kind of there's like a you to his address where he's both kind of defending the defending, you know, white Southern racist values, but also there's like a you to like a folding in of the audience into what he's saying, and I think that makes a lot of people uncomfortable. Lots of people told me to cut that out of the film. Actually, I think there's just something generative to discomfort and sitting patiently in the discomfort for long enough that you kind of can, just think differently about what's happening in the space and what are the dynamics.
You could have used those voices differently. You could have been critical in your approach, but you weren't. I didn't feel that you were. I thought you allowed both groups to just be who they were. You didn't comment on at all.
Yeah, and the thing, like, I never work with I don't even love the word interview, but I never work with that material as like a soundbite. Like, there's a kind of violence for me around like extracting the one thing that someone says that is part of my or the filmmaker's argument. So I think I'm really committed to never cutting people's voices in that way, but always kind of leaving a space, leaving a context, leaving a complexity around what someone is saying, so that there's a feeling of like a full encounter. And I think even when it's long enough, like with the guys in the cafe, like for me, that scene felt really, there was something incredibly compelling and seductive to me about this mix of kind of incredible violence, but also incredible tenderness that these men are kind of like, that are like smashed up right next to each other. That felt like a very masculine space, but was also it's like tender and it's social. And there's a lot of kind of gentleness expressed by these men, while also they're kind of laughing about the nuclear bomb. So for me, it's in those spaces that are difficult and can hold something that's complex and contradictory and maybe uncomfortable, that's where a different kind of listening can maybe start to unfold.
Yeah, excellent. And the other thing is, talking about voice, is that in your films, we hear your voice. And I just wonder why you make that decision. Why is that decision important for you?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's back to Trinh Minh, right? Like, I think there's, like, any filmmaker has a position. Anytime a camera appears in a situation, there's both a positionality and a power dynamic that's inherent to the presence of the camera. And this is not my idea. It's a really old idea, but I think just that acknowledgement of being in the space and having a position, and even that you hear my voice and it's a female presenting voice that you hear off camera. And I think all of that is important for kind of locating kind of who's in the room that you don't see.
Yeah. And do you think it's important for the audience to know that it's a female behind the camera?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, and especially in especially in Richland, where we were. Yeah, I mean, you were saying it seems like a different film. Like, it's definitely a film with a lot of men and a lot of male space and a lot of like military space. And I think what we were, kind of what our positionality and orientation was as we entered the space as a very small and intimate crew of two women is quite different from what might happen when a different kind of film crew is entering that space. And I think that's important to hold as kind of part of what's happening in the encounters of the film.
I'm just wondering, how did you sell the idea to the residents? Were they willing participants, or they were?
Yeah, people were so generous, and I think that's important. It took it's a community in Richland where there's a very profound insider-outsider dynamic, and there's actually a lot of bad history of the town feeling like work that's made about the town is quite judgmental. And I think it's true. There's a lot of either investigative journalism work that's happened where people kind of show up already with a kind of agenda to make an expose or critique of the nuclear weapons industry, or to make fun of the town for loving the nuclear bomb. So I think there's a definite awareness in the town of the danger of representation and the danger of bad representation. So I knew that going in, and I expected a lot more resistance and that it would be hard to kind of find my way in. But actually, I think people really appreciate when they feel listened to. Every kind of person appreciates having space made for them. And I think people, felt that in the way that I approached them and the way that I worked with them. And I would tell, I would speak to people before meeting them with a camera, and the kinds of things I would tell people. I spent a lot of time describing how I work and what my method is, and explaining things the time commitment is very long. My work takes years. I'm not just showing up and making something and in a couple of days, but there's a commitment to really being in the community for a long time. I'm not an investigative journalist. I don't have an agenda. I'm not making an anti-nuclear film. I'm interested in something else that's really around just spending time with people and understanding how people interact with this history. So yeah, I think just in presenting the work in that way, it made people more comfortable.
Yeah. And I suppose for me, the film is not at all didactic in any way. It just leaves space for us to engage with the audience, with participants in our way. But I think it demonstrates the need, for me, my reading, that people have to hold on to what defines their existence as they know it, and how ways of behaving and past actions can be rationalized. And I think a lot of the residents have rationalized past actions of maybe their parents or but they're comfortable. They find a place where they make that a comfortable choice, even though those actions might be harmful, not necessarily ethical. And I suppose this is the conservatism that's coming out of the film. And I suppose an example of that is if we play the first clip, the Richmond community, and we can talk about it afterwards.
Yeah. Although I wanted to kind of say a quick thing about that before. I think we've all rationalized things and I think that was part of what drew me to this space, is that it felt quite universal, that Richland is a specific case study and a specific history. But yeah, we all know about climate change. We all know about, slavery. I think there are ways where all of us every day are kind of doing things with kind of all kinds of denial or not looking at the whole of something that's really hard to look at.
Yeah, no, that's fair. Yeah. That's fair comment. If we can play the first clip, please.
There is a special need for reconciliation between the cities of Richland and Nagasaki, because it was we residents of Richland who produced the plutonium for the Nagasaki atomic bomb. I say that not in judgment of any persons, but simply as a statement of historical fact. Reconciliation requires that we take care of the hurts on both sides of the war. Reconciliation compels us to remember those Americans who died at Pearl Harbor, at Bataan, Corregidor, the Philippines, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, and every place in which that tragic war was fought. Now we invite all of you to come forward and ring the bell of peace.
For refugees everywhere.
In honor of my father, Alexander, U.S. Army 8th Air Corps, and my uncle, Emilio, U.S. Army 8th Air Corps.
First, I want to just say that I was thinking about ringing the Nagasaki bell for Wanapam and Yakima and Umatilla, whose land was used by the Hanford Project, the Manhattan Project. But then I thought, it's not quite ready for the reconciliation, because it hasn't been acknowledged in that level that need start the process. So I just want to mention that. And also, I see that I'm the only color person in this room, and that makes me, I just want to say that it's quite uncomfortable to, speak using this podium and talk to you all. So I just want to point that out.
Okay, great, thank you. So that that clip sort of was the day after the 76th anniversary commemorating the bombing of atomic bomb being dropped. I can hear something in the background. Sorry, it's distracting. Right, lovely. Yeah, that's better. And I don't know if you want to say anything about that, Irene, before I sort of move on to the question. I'm thinking in particular about Kyo, that voice is there. Sorry, is there feedback? It sounds, it's distracting. I don't know if you can, oh, right, that's gone, thank you. Yes, so I'm thinking in particular about Yukio occupying that space. I don't know if there's anything that you wanted to say about that.
Yeah, I mean, I invited her. I think that's important to know that there is a kind of intervention that, which I think I feel fine. I think like a journalist wouldn't do that, but I'm not a journalist. And I, at that point, had already spent quite a lot of time in the community. And I think I was really interested in thinking with Yuki about what would happen in a room if she were in that kind of space. She's someone, I met her, she was interested already in Hanford issues for a long time. So I met her in kind of a stakeholder Zoom room, which over the summer before that ceremony, the National Park Service in the US had been holding these kinds of listening sessions, they called them, where actually there was not a lot of listening. It seemed like people were showing up with these very kind of very hard points of view, or nuclear and pro-Hanford, or they're like anti-nuclear activists, and there was not a lot of listening in the listening sessions, was my perception. But I met her in one of these spaces, and she was the only, both actually, like as in the film, she was the only Japanese person who was there and the only non-white person in the space. And so I reached out to her afterwards because I had been trying to figure out how to bring in a Japanese voice into the project. And yeah, together we kind of came up with this idea where she would come for this around the time when the ceremony was happening. And yet she actually, I think, didn't expect to be speaking at that event. I think she was kind of put on the spot. But yeah, I think, I was interested, of course, in not in her feeling put on the spot, but in how does that change the dynamic in the room to bring someone in who's a very different and kind of surprising voice. who's speaking from a different position. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. I was thinking that, you know, it was clearly very emotional for her, and took strength of character for her to stand in the room and say, I don't feel that there are reconciliations happening here at the moment, so I'm not going to ring the bell.
Yeah. No, it's amazing it's amazing that she said those things. Yeah, and you feel in the ceremony before, right, that there's kind of an effort and there's a space made, but there is this kind of like both sidesism of like, but also Pearl Harbor, and also all of like, there's not really quite a full kind of taking on or looking at the thing. So yeah, I think she's kind of a disruptive voice who's able to like do a certain kind of thing in the space that felt important to try to activate.
Yeah, really interesting. And we see how beautiful the landscape is in Hanford, in Hanford, and also that then you introduce, or earlier on, the Wanapum community. So we don't see them for very long, but we have that their presence is, you know, it lingers throughout the film, really. And I just wondered, your choice in not featuring them very much in the film, in terms of the, you know, the minutes that they take up in the film, and what your decision making process was around that.
Yeah, there's two tribes actually in the film. So the tribe at the beginning is not the Wanapum. That's a different tribe. And there's actually 6 tribes, and some of this was access. So there's 6 different tribes that are stakeholders or have kind of traditional use of land. And Hanford's quite large. It's 600 square miles. So it's a huge amount of land. And so there's 6 different tribes that in one way or another, either in a migratory way or for hunting and fishing. So different kind of relationships with the land, and all of those tribes have some kind of like stakeholder seat at the table in kind of conversations around cleanup and land management. So the 2 tribes in the film are the Wanapum and the Confederated tribes of the Umatilla Reservation. And yeah, those 2 were just, it was quite complicated to kind of figure out the right way to approach those communities and to get access. And then those were the 2 that invited me to film. And yeah, you're right, in terms of time, it's not so much time in the film, but it's important time. Like the film opens with this tribal kind of native planting that's happening. That's this kind of restoration ecology project to try to replant Hanford land with native plants. And yeah, that felt like a really powerful, I think, both kind of action and gesture and project, and also metaphor for this kind of, you know, project that can't possibly be finished ever, because a lot of the land is actually too contaminated to replant, and always will be.
There was an injustice
kind of effort to restore. Yeah, so that's, I mean, I think that feels like, you know, land acknowledgement, and it's the opening of the film, and I think kind of sets an intention where we're kind of thinking about that as we move into these other much wider spaces that are Richland community spaces, that we're kind of holding that in the background. And yeah, the same with the family. I think that's such an important part of the film, this moment where you meet the Wanapum family, which actually most of that tribe is just the one family. It's quite small now. And yeah, it's this kind of intergenerational moment of thinking about who's inheriting the land and what does that mean.
Yeah, that's lovely. Yeah,
it's less about time, but it's more about the interweaving of these different spaces. And I think when we spend time with those voices in those spaces, it transforms our relationship and our thinking about, I think, all the other spaces in the film.
Yeah, lovely. Well, I thought it was a great film, and for me, I watched it and I thought, yes, I can see that this is an Irene Lusztig film. There were elements there that just carried through. So yeah, great. I read an interview where you said of history that it's a huge misunderstanding to think of history as progressive or forward marching. History is circular, it's cyclical. It goes backwards, it goes forwards, that you were curious now about conversations, new energies relating to feminism, and history shifts and changes all the time depending on where you're standing at the present, which I love that last bit. Have you come to this conclusion as a filmmaker who uses archive in her work and so is able to get a sense of the world as it shifts and perhaps doesn't change but is cyclical? And would you say there is still hope for those of us who strive for social equity and parity and so on?
Yeah, of course. I mean, things change. It's not that things don't change, but I think this kind of progress narrative idea of both filmmaking and history is seductive but dangerous, where it's like, you know, all moving toward like a good outcome at the end. I think, you know, some of it is just what I'm interested. Like, I think what interests me when I think about history is what I really call the present tense of history, and all of the ways that history is still with us, whether it's in landscape or in people's bodies or in, you know, stories that people carry with them. To me, that's very, just powerful and generative space to kind of spend time with history, but in this really present tense space. I think a lot of the method, you know, like for Years in Sisterhood, which is this kind of deeply archival project where everything is based on this archive from 40 years ago. People, especially people who knew my work on the Motherhood Archives, which is all archival footage, people were very curious. And it was a question I got a lot of, like, why don't you show the letters? Why don't you show the 70s? Like, where's the archive? And to me, it felt incredibly important to keep the viewer in that present tense of history and kind of withhold the nostalgia of the archive and the beauty of, I don't know, like paper and materials from a long time ago. But just to ask us to sit in the present and engage with that history from the present, and like through people's bodies and through.
Yeah.
And yeah, I think like that way of working invites us to think differently with history as something that's kind of still with us and still changes, I think, depending on, and even, you know, like me as someone, when I'm looking at this archive from 40 years ago, for example, as a researcher in 2014 or whenever I did the research for that film, even like which voices from the archive like rise up to the surface for me, or what feels urgent in 2014 is obviously really different from what felt urgent to the magazine editors in the 1970s. So I think even, like who's the reader, what's their position, what's the moment in time, what else are we thinking about, what's happening? I think all of that is what makes history, right?
And I wanted to move on to Yours in Sisterhood, actually. So this was your film where you, it was archived, so it was women who wrote in to Ms. Magazine, 70s and 80s. These were mainly letters that were not published. You went into the archive. I think I read that there was something like 2,000 of them. You got it down to 800, and then from the 800 you filmed over 300, but used about 20 in the film, about 20 women in the film. So these are women from present day reading.
There's one man. There's one man. There's one man in the film.
Yes, there is. Yeah, reading letters 40 years ago that were sent into Ms. Magazine, and so that sort of gives you a brief background, and it struck me that the contemporary readers, the women you filmed, they became custodians of those words, of those written by women from previous decades, and they had a real sense of responsibility, I think, as they assumed the roles and the emotions of those disembodied and muted to some extent. And I say muted because the letters weren't published, so the voices didn't come, weren't heard. I think if we have a watch of a clip from, and then we can talk about that. Thanks, Alex.
Dear editor, like most growth processes, feminist growth is often accompanied by growing pains. I've just returned from the National Now Convention in Detroit, where I witnessed both the growth and the pains. Sisters were destructively and often irrationally played against each other. After 2 days of warm and supportive sisterhood, the unity of the movement was seriously threatened by a political chasm on the third and final day of the convention. The feminist movement, largely represented by now, must be mature enough to encompass political diversity, as it has racial, occupational, and sexual diversity. Black or white, Democrat or socialist, lesbian or straight, we are all women suffering mutual oppression from political, cultural, social, economic forces. We have far too many enemies attempting to undermine us from without, to create new foes from within our ranks. Divisiveness and paranoia are lethal elements which will asphyxiate our life's breath if we allow them to develop. Let us confront our differences with honest dialogue and an agreement to disagree on many issues. Then, let's get on to emergency issues facing us all, particularly ERA ratification. Progress is crisis-oriented, the publisher of my college newspaper, For Once I Which Reported, used to say. Feminism has had and will continue to have its crises. Let's face them with a spirit of inclusivity and progress. A reader in Cincinnati. So as I prepared to read the letter, I started to think about who the letter writer might be. And the first thing that immediately came to my mind was that the letter writer was not a woman of color. And mostly because of this notion that we should just agree to disagree. When the agreement to disagree is rooted in my oppression as a woman of color, it's really hard for me to just get on with it and to talk about emergency issues, because my oppression to me feels like an emergency issue, as I would imagine many other women of color felt at that time. I would imagine the political chasm on the third day that she talked about had to do with some kind of racial inclusivity or other issues of inclusivity, possibly even class. I was sympathetic to the writer, because I understood the point she was trying to make, but I feel like it was a little misguided. Yeah.
And what does it feel like to have those words in your body?
It felt a little bit violent. It did. It felt like I can't be repeating this because I don't agree with it. Like, it's totally counter to my safety as a person, what she's suggesting, that we just move on with it. I think for me, that was kind of the most striking part of the letter for me, this notion of just agreeing to disagree and facing more emergency issues. Like, how do we decide what issue is an emergency issue as people who occupy multiple marginalized identities? It felt really hard to read and to feel convincing in reading it. That felt really weird and hard to do.
Great. So we've got we've just seen of Letitia, is how brilliant I found the casting for that, because you actually matched in a lot of cases the writers of 40 years ago with the experiences of people with similar experiences today or back then. And that was generally what you'd, and some of the casting, some of the women, the experiences of, I'm thinking of one woman in particular who described herself as I'm trying to think of the word, I can't remember how she described herself, but basically she was, I think was she a prostitute? Was she?
Oh, Jenny, the sex worker at the end of the film?
Yeah, exactly. And that was great. And, and we were able to hear her voice and her truth really from that. But in the clip that we've just seen with Letitia, it's the casting, it's, she's reading the letter of a woman who's white, and that really conflicts with her and with her own voice. Can you explain why you cast it that way? What was your thinking?
Yeah, I mean, maybe it's similar to what we were talking about with the men in the cafe, where I'm like interested in the thing where there's a friction or something that's like where we're listening generously but also uncomfortable, and what can that produce when those two things are happening at the same time. I think earlier in the project I was definitely more interested in finding these kind of really aligned readers and kind of matching pretty closely somebody's experience in a letter with the contemporary reader. And then, yeah, over time, I did, 300 shoots, like you said, and I just got more playful, I think, over time, and more curious about what would happen if, something is similar, but it's not exactly a match. Like there was one where it was a letter from a lesbian reader in the 70s who self-identified as a lesbian and was writing about like lack of lesbian representation in the magazine. And, like for that letter, I was like, well, what would be, I think that issue is much different now. There's been a lot of progress and much more representation of LGBTQ people in mainstream media. But what might be another thing that's kind of not quite there yet? And for that letter, the person I ended up inviting was deaf and a trans man. And he ends up speaking a lot more about trans representation, which at the time was kind of, and already that has changed a lot since 2018 when the film came out. But at that time was kind of a space with much less mainstream representation. So in that case, it's like, not exactly the same, but kind of thinking about how to take some kind of essence from the letter and move it into a more present day space. Yeah. And yeah, then with Letitia, I was really, with the reading that we just watched, there's something really powerful also about disagreement and disidentification and being able to disagree, right, and say I don't feel this voice that I've just put in my body. I don't agree with it, or I don't.
I love that she said,
I don't identify.
Yeah, I love that she said it felt violent.
Yeah, it's amazing. So yeah, and I think we both knew, I think we both knew going in that it was probably not a letter written by a woman of color, and I think we both had a similar kind of guess. And the letter is quite vague, actually, right? It doesn't say what the big issue was, but I think, we can imagine these kinds of like big 70s feminist conventions were often kind of becoming contentious around class and race lines. So I think for me there was something, and I think for Letitia also, there was something powerful about inviting her to like kind of both listen to that voice, but also disagree with, or kind of.
And I suppose
counter with her own voice.
Yes, exactly. That's what I was going to say. I suppose for me, it's she experiences someone else's voice, and it's not true to her embodied consciousness, and that sort of I suppose it conflicts with her experience of her own voice, basically. Mm-hmm. And the conference explores ideas around using voice as an act of resistance and also as a tool for change. And I suppose I wonder what voice means for you.
Yeah, it's interesting. I know that the whole speaking series is about voice, so I was trying to think about voice, and then it's actually listening is the term that I'm so much more drawn to than voice. I think I do have things to say about voice, but really like deeply in relation to listening to voice and making space for, like when Years in Sisterhood came out, it actually really bothered me that a lot of the critical response to the film kept using this term that I'm like giving a voice to, like giving people a voice or giving the letters a voice. And I don't know, I feel like that puts a lot of power, gives a lot of power to the filmmaker and really centers the filmmaker in a way that I'm not so comfortable with. Like I think the voices are there, and it's about how are we oriented as listeners, and who are we paying attention to, and who are we making space for. But it's related to voice, but it's it's about kind of what is our position, or our how receptive are we to voice, and what does it mean to kind of tune in to voices that are there?
Yeah. And talking about voice, your voice as a filmmaker, So what is it that you feel that you need, must, would like to say as a feminist filmmaker?
Yeah, I feel like, again, I would really feel much more invested in this idea of that I'm offering a listening space, or that I think of myself as like a facilitator, whether it's kind of working with people, or drawing something out, or inviting a kind of relationship between a person and a history, or a person and an archive, that my job is to mediate, I think, rather than to speak loudly, I guess. But I'm interested in offering those spaces, I think, of facilitation and listening. Well, I think more than kind of privilege. And like so much of film history and theory is around this idea of like authorial voice and filmmaking voice, and I would love to just decenter those ideas in the way that we think about film.
Thank you. So I think we've got a question. I found your discussion on comfortable spaces really interesting, especially when questioning who those spaces are comfortable for, and in the context of generating discomfort. Could you expand more on this?
Yeah, that's a really unstable, that's a great question, kind of who something is uncomfortable for. And of course, it's really unstable because it really depends on who the viewer is as well. So it's not just my position and the position of the person on screen, but of course there's whatever people in the room are bringing into the room from their own lived experience. So yeah, there's not like a simple answer for that. But I'm definitely interested. For example, I can give an example of that conversation that you brought up in the cafe, which unfortunately we weren't able to watch, but it's someone who is actually begins by speaking in a way that seems more kind of against the nuclear kind of symbolism that's in the community, but eventually switches to this kind of defense of kind of American history, white American history, great men of American history. And that scene I find is actually the most uncomfortable for white viewers because of the way that it folds the viewer into a kind of shared, assumed shared space or shared point of view. I think viewers of color feel very differently toward that scene and that space. So yeah, I think I'm interested in all of the ways that these things hold a lot of complexity, and there's not one. Yeah, like a scene can feel really, or an encounter, or a conversation can feel completely different to someone who's listening, depending, of course, on what they're bringing into the viewing. Yeah. I don't know if that's an answer, but it's a reflection.
Lovely, thank you. Another question. Would you say that people already have a voice and that we need to listen? I'm also wondering about what happens or how do we listen when voices are silent or silenced?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's related, I think, to the kinds of things I try to do in my work, which is just making expansive and generous space for listening. But yeah, I think that's a thing that we can do as filmmakers, is to kind of make space, or amplify is another word that I think is useful. And yeah, of course, there's all kinds of people with voices who don't have a platform, or don't yet have the tools or the context to be listened to. So I think that's work that we can do as kind of cultural producers.
So did you feel a responsibility to do that in your work, through your work?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, but I think even with, like, in Richland, I want to say, even with like more conservative voices, I felt a huge responsibility actually to make a listening space that's generous with those voices. Like, I think in festival audiences, I think, are largely not conservative communities, like kind of culture communities, tend to be really separate communities. I think there's not a lot of willingness to just give that space. I think there's such a knee-jerk response at this point of like I can't hear you, or like what you're saying is like offensive or wrong. So thinking about, and it's quite tricky, like how do you do that without actually amplifying something that maybe is offensive or is wrong? But I think how do you make a space that can just be generous and gentle?
And you certainly have done that in Richland. You've brought those spaces, those people. You've enabled listening, to use your terms, to 3 different groups basically in Richland. I think really interesting. Thank you so much. Well, we've come to the end of our hour, Irene. Thank you. It's been such a pleasure.
Yeah, thank you for all your questions.
Thank you so much. And yes, thank you for sharing with us today. At the beginning of the talk, or as Ramisha said, the When I Dare to Be Powerful season of events, this was our final talk in that season. So thank you, Ramisha, for mediating. Thank you to our sponsors, Midlands for Cities, New Art Exchange, Postcolonial Studies Centre, and of course Bonington Gallery for sponsoring the event, and for your ongoing support. So Alex was with us tonight and has been with us for the past few weeks. Josh was with us from the beginning, and you've been brilliant. And of course, Tom, thank you. So it's been a great experience. Thanks to everyone for supporting us, to our panelists, our podcasts, online speakers, our keynote speakers, and of course, a huge thank you to the When I Dare to Be Powerful team. Just to remind you that it's still possible to listen to all our talks via the Bonington Gallery YouTube, as well as our website, and that is When I Dare to Be Powerful, all one word, .wordpress.com. We'll continue conversations relating to voice, or as Irene puts it, listening, and we hope you do too. So thank you once again, Irene. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks so much.